Imagine spending 50 years on the edge of survival, navigating the untamed Wild West as a scout, a guide, and a warrior. John Young Nelson wasn't just a frontiersman, he was a legend. Adopted by the Sioux, married to a Native American woman, and a trusted scout for the U.S. Army, his life was a whirlwind of adventure, danger, and resilience. From surviving deadly ambushes to guiding caravans through treacherous terrain, Nelson's story is more than just history. It's the raw, unfiltered essence of the American frontier. His journey stands as one of the most legendary accounts of a mountain man ever recorded, and in this narration will bring his incredible tale to life, told through his own extraordinary first-hand testimony. Join me as we uncover the legendary life of John Young Nelson, a man who lived and thrived where few dared to tread. The campfire is ready, so stay with me tonight. The story is about to start. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Chapter 1. I was born on August 25, 1826, at Charleston, Virginia. My father and mother were both Americans, so I may claim to be of the true Southern breed. My mother's maiden name was Young, and I take my second Christian name from her. My father for many years occupied the position of overseer of the salt works at Maiden. Maiden is about 12 miles from Charleston. A large number of enslaved individuals were slaves there, and of these he had charge. The South held significant power in the United States at this time, with its economy heavily reliant on slavery. My early experiences were those of enslaved individuals and children, who were my playmates and companions. It was little thought in those days that the bugle would ever sound that would plunge the elements of brotherhood into bitter strife. Yet 35 years later, this was the case, and strange to say, I, who was reared in a perfect hotbed of slavery and regarded it as one of the laws of nature, knew little or nothing at the time of the struggle that was taking place. Perhaps it was better for me I did not, for my lot would most assuredly have been thrown in with the Confederate cause, with the probable result that I should have met a soldier's death. I can carry my mind back to 6 years of age. I remember a small white dog I used to set at the enslaved individuals when they beat me. This was by no means an unusual occurrence when no one was looking. At length my dog, his name was Peep, was found one morning in a boiling salt pan. Young as I was, I determined to have my revenge. I took it on a black people boy who was a trifle bigger than myself. My father had always told me never to fight, but if I did, to make sure I won, but if I did, to be sure and come out victorious. Besides bossing the salt business, my father made tubs on his own account for storing the salt, and he owned a cooperative where he had some 60 slaves at work. About 3 miles from the salt works was a coal mine. This supplied the works with fuel, run down in cars on a laid track every 15 minutes. I took my young black people out on the track and started fighting him right in front of my father's cooperative. The black people got me down, and I was getting the worst of it, when my father came out with a hickory hoop in his hand. He walked up to us and said to me, "Didn't I tell you never to fight with anyone unless you won? Now you fought and got the worst of it. I'm going to give you some more." With this, he started whacking me and the enslaved boy. We were both still fighting and clutching. One moment I would be uppermost and get the hickory, and the next it would come down on his hide. I couldn't stand getting thrashed both ways, so I grabbed a piece of iron that had been splintered off the rails and came within my reach as I rolled over. With this, I almost hurt the boy severely before my father discovered what I was up to. When he realized the position, he separated us and gave me the worst hiding I ever had. I don't believe the black people bled half as much as I did after my father had done with me. This performance, I think, showed a pretty bloodthirsty temperament for a youngster. I little thought then what after years had in store for me. I was sent to school, but I was always larking about and playing pranks on my schoolfellows instead of attending to my books and trying to learn anything. My mother said I was the most mischievous boy in Virginia. I believe she was right. Before I was 12, I had become the terror of the neighborhood. My hidings about this time became frequent. Something unpleasant was always occurring, not through any fault of mine. There was an orchard at the back of the cooperage, fenced in with cedar posts, which were very difficult and expensive to procure. People, at some time or another, had been shooting in this orchard, and, instead of hitting anything alive, had buried their bullets in these posts. I discovered this, and thinking lead more valuable than cedar, I chopped the posts up to get the bullets out. I had destroyed a dozen in this way when my father was called upon to pay for them. Of course, I got a hiding. It was to be in 12 lessons, one for each post. After the third, I bolted. They got hotter each time, and as I began to wonder what the 12th would be like, I thought it better to skip before it was due. In the middle of the night, I stole out of the house and tramped up to Charleston. A friend of my father's, named Aaron Whitaker, had a store there, and to him I went and unburdened all my grievances. He took me in, and I stayed with him a month before my father found out where I was. At length he came over with a leather whip, and making me run in front of his horse with a rope round my waist and fast to his saddle, tanned me all the way home. Never shall I forget that whacking. I was one mass of wheels. I swore I would run away again, and waiting until a favorable opportunity occurred, I availed myself of it a few months afterwards. There was no particular row this time. I had made up my mind to go, and nothing would deter me. I had often heard my father speak of his brother-in-law, who lived up in the state of Missouri. His name was Thomas Atkinson, and he had married my mother's sister. I had no idea of distance, or I should probably never have undertaken the journey. I set about it by running off to an aunt, a sister of my father's, who lived about 50 miles from Maiden. This distance I did on foot, and arriving safely, was put up comfortably. But my aunt insisted upon writing to my mother to say I was there. In about 3 weeks an answer came from my father, saying he was coming over to fetch me. This was quite enough to scare me out of my wits. I had not forgotten the last time he had taken this trouble on my account. Instead of going to bed that night, I slipped out of the house and, starting off by a circuitous route, made my way to Charleston. On the terrors of that journey I will not dilate. In each shadow I saw, or fancied I saw, the stalwart form of my father, whip in hand, ready to tan me every step of the way home again. At length I arrived, footsore and weary, feeling like a hunted dog, and not daring to show my face more than I could help. For 3 days I hung about the quays and warehouses, sleeping at night on bales of cotton, or secreting myself in any out-of-the-way corner where I could rest unobserved. I had a little money, enough to last me about a week, and laid it out principally in gingerbread and crackers, upon which I lived. Chapter 2. My uncle's ranch was on the direct route to the prairie lands of Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Anco, which were then known under the general term of the Great American Desert. It was not often that we had a party of traders, bound west, passing our place. Still, these did come along at times in bands numbering from 20 to 50, a force strong enough to cope with any little difficulty that might arise between them and the Indians, with whom they traded knives, beads, etc., in exchange for furs. But this business was carried on many hundred miles from Boonville. Some 90 miles above my uncle's place the boundless prairie began, and extended no one in our part knew where. Even the traders were ignorant of its illimitable expanse, for they only visited certain locations, to which at stated times of the year they knew the Indians would come in order to unload their stock. The time I am now speaking of was before Kansas attracted the attention of Missouri and the other southern states, and the question arose as to whether it should be made a slave state. This finally resulted in the border warfare between the Slavists and Free Soilers, terminating in the victory of the latter. Students of American history, keeping this period in their minds, will be able to form a general opinion of the condition of this portion of the country at the time I arrived there. When I had been with my uncle a little over a year and a half, one May morning I was looking after the cows. Presently, I spied in the distance a convoy of prairie schooners, as they were called, coming towards the ranch. I rode out a few miles to meet them and found they mustered about 55 men. They were on a trading expedition and said they were bound for Nebraska. That night, they corralled close to my uncle's ranch. In a wagon corral, all the wagons are drawn long ways into position so as to form a circle, the front wheels of one being drawn up to and placed alongside the hind wheels of its predecessor, and so on until a complete circle is formed. The wheels are then chained together. In a peaceful country, the mules or cattle would be left with their heads towards the circumference of the circle, but in a fighting corral, their heads would be turned towards the center, and the forage unloaded and packed as high as the wagon boxes, so as to make a very substantial fort. I was decidedly of a wandering disposition. The gypsy nature was in my constitution, although not in my blood. I knew that I should do no good where I was. Herding cows all day did not give me that element of excitement for which I had run away from home. Apart from this, young as I was, I had been my own master, earned my own living, and the feeling of independence strong within me was often checked by my uncle, who persistently set me to do things he knew I hated. Looking after cows I found particularly monotonous, and I lessened the tedium of it by making practice with my gun. In this way, I became an expert shot. As a horseman, I could hold my own with any of the men on my uncle's ranch, or near it. My reputation in this respect spread around, and any squatter with a particularly unruly horse sent it to my uncle's for me to break in. I never found any difficulty with horses, and never yet came across an animal that I could not stick on to. In most things required round about a ranch, I was an adept for a youngster of 17, and as I was strong and well set up, I was just the sort of youth likely to recommend himself to a party of traders. It was not surprising, therefore, that they spotted me and asked me if I would like to go along with them. I was willing enough, but my uncle did not quite see it. He knew what my value was to him and did not care to part with me. However, I prevailed upon him, saying that if he did not give his consent, I should go without it. Chapter 3. Our progress was slow but steady, and the days and weeks passed over with but little variation in our daily routine. Thus far, we had met with no adventures worth chronicling, and we began to think the stories of Indians the old hands were never tired of pouring into the ears of the younger members of the outfit originated entirely in their own imaginations. The country through which we were now passing was terra incognita to all of us. Our course was steered simply by the compass and the stars, and we could form no idea how long it would take to reach the Indians of whom we were in quest, or what the country would be like in which we found them. About 3 months had elapsed since we first struck the prairie, when we at length arrived upon the banks of the Platte River. We followed its course for about 2 weeks. Suddenly, one afternoon, at a bend in the river, we came upon an Indian encampment of about 400 teepees, or tents, and, as far as we could judge, about 2,000 Indians. There was much consternation amongst our party at first when we discovered the magnitude of the band, but as there was no chance of turning back, we put on a bold face and determined to see the thing through. We, however, found the Indians peaceably disposed and bent upon trading with us. This was my first introduction to Native Americans, and I felt much interest in them. From the moment they came into camp, they exercised a charm over me, and I determined before the day's trading operations were over to make a study of their habits and customs and become more intimately acquainted with them. This I knew was only to be done by living amongst them, and I determined at all risks to do that. I was utterly sick and tired of our caravan life, and its continuation had no attractions for me. We traded with this band for about a fortnight and secured everything they had to dispose of. At length the negotiations were concluded and orders given that we should continue our journey the following day. I had made up my mind what to do, and accordingly, before sunset on the last day, I slung my rifle over my shoulder and, bidding farewell to my faithful Mustang, left our corral unobserved and walked down to the Indian encampment. No one molested me, so onward I strolled amongst the teepees, when, making straight for a decent-looking one, I lifted up the flap, entered, and sat down. There were 5 women present, and a chief. They were astonished to see me, and I thought the chief meant coming at me with a knife which he had in his hand. But, assuming all the sang-froid I was capable of, I took no notice of either of them. Immediately I squatted down, they all began to chatter away, the construction I put upon their remarks being that they admired my darned impudence. Anyway, I stayed where I had planted myself and smiled approvingly upon them. Of course, I could not understand a word they said, nor they a word I said. I looked around, boylike, and was much interested in what I saw. In the center of the teepee, a wood fire was burning. The smoke from this curled upwards, and found its way out where the teepee poles clustered together at the top. The teepee itself was made of skins sewn together with raw hide, and ranged longitudinally around this were several long-looking basket boxes made of willow, all painted different colors. In each of these a buffalo robe, which led me to suppose that they were the beds of the chief and his women. I also noticed at the back of each a sort of valise or bag, also made of skin. And Chapter 4. The Indians are a race of people, the reverse of the white man, in every respect. The former wishes to become rich, the Indian prefers to remain poor. He who gives away the most is considered the best and bravest among the Native Americans. The Indians are a nomad race, ever on the move. They believe in traveling about for their health's sake, and this is the principal reason why they never remain long in one place. I have known them even to leave the buffalo, which they follow as the magnet turns to the north, simply because their restlessness prevented them from keeping still. From a year to 18 months old, they are inured to hardships of every description. At this age, I have seen them running about barefooted in the snow without any ill effect. The principle of their rearing consists in making them undergo hardships that would kill a white child. The sole idea an Indian has is to excel in the art of war. This is a sort of creed with them, and the trouble and patience they expend in teaching their children war is worthy of a better cause. Almost as soon as a youngster can run alone, a bow and arrow are put into his hand, and he is taught to shoot at objects, such as a rabbit, a wolf, or a dog. These he will torture in a manner in which cruelty in its worst form is displayed. Every living thing he is taught to kill. Even the cattle around the camp are not free from this pernicious precocity, and it is no uncommon thing to find the cows that supply them with milk stuck all over with these baby arrows, which the youngsters have only sufficient power to send into their hides without doing any internal injury. As a rule, the Indian is a pretty cleanly being, the Sioux being the best in this respect. But taking all Indians generally, they do not seem to think cleanliness next to godliness, as we understand it. They are fond of the water in the summertime, but in the winter avoid it like the plague. During the warm weather, they seem almost to live in the river, if their camp is anywhere near one, and most of them can swim like ducks. Swimming is an essential part of a youngster's education, and next to riding is the most necessary, for it frequently happens that in crossing streams both rider and horse have to battle for their lives. The usual method of crossing a river is for the lodge poles, which are very light, to be tied together in the form of a raft, upon which the camp gear, utensils, etc. are placed, and this is then towed by 30 or 40 bucks, harnessing themselves to and swimming across the river. The women do all the work about the camp. A young Indian buck would disdain to touch anything. It would be an insult to ask him to. He will look placidly on and see the women struggling over a heavy load and not move a muscle to help them. He is quite a superior being in his own opinion, and under the impression that his only mission in life is to hunt and fight. Women are traditionally responsible for the work around the camp. As rule, he will not do the most simple thing for himself. He is essentially lazy. One of the admirable traits in Native American culture is their deep spiritual connection. In this, he is an example to the white man. Their great spirit up above is the one they worship, and for him they will undergo any torture. For instance, in their sun dance, which occurs every year, usually in June or July, the pains they undergo are surprising. Then some thousands of them will meet at a certain place, previously appointed, and where wood, water, and grass are plentiful. The teepees are arranged in a great circle, sometimes over a mile in diameter, and in the center is a smaller one of posts interwoven with brush and able to hold about 1,000 persons. This is roofed in about 30 feet from its circumference with the teepee poles, and thus a large open space is left in the center. In this space is a large drum, the sun dance drum. Proceedings are opened with a feast in which everybody participates, the bucks having previously been hunting the buffalo for the purpose. After the feast, an Indian maiden, 16 to 25 years old, previously selected, rises, and having given 3 blows on the drum, says, "If there is any man in this assembly who knows better, let him here step forth and say so." Should there be an affirmative response, very rarely the case, the girl is spurned and treated to every kind of indignity, spat at, pelted with mud, and finally turned out of the community. Chapter 5. Among the Ogalallas the time passed pleasantly enough. Spotted Tail was chief of the Brulés, and on this hunting expedition accompanied our band merely as a guest, but as he was a chief of renown, there was a tacit understanding that he was in command. One morning, as I was starting with some of the young bucks on a trapping expedition, Spotted Tail called me into his teepee, and looking at me steadily, said, "Cha-sha-sha o Podjo, I think it is time you took a woman." "It is very kind of you to think of my comfort," I replied. "I and my women," he continued, "together with my friends have been talking over this matter, and we have come to the conclusion that a woman will be good for you. You are now one of our nation. You need someone to keep your home and cook your food, instead of my women doing it for you." Since I had first walked into Spotted Tail's lodge that memorable morning, his women had always looked after me, kept my teepee in order, and done everything necessary for my comfort. I suppose they had begun to kick at this, and probably with some cause, doubtless thinking it was high time I was taken off their hands. "My friend," I replied, "I am young and foolish, yet I think this little matter had better be deferred until I am older and have more sense." "No, my son," said Spotted Tail, "we have decided that a woman is good for you, and a woman you must have. She will help you in many respects. You will learn the language more quickly and better, and above all, you will have someone to look after you." I saw at once that the chief was determined and that it was no use my objecting, so I remarked, "Well, chief, since you wish it, so let it be. Whose daughter do you propose?" "My niece, Wambly ZZ, Yellow Elk," was his answer. "Good," I replied. "I will endeavor to render myself worthy of her." A long conversation then ensued in which Spotted Tail's women took part. It was finally arranged that I should pay my court to the young lady, with whom, by the by, I was only slightly acquainted, and woo her in the manner prescribed by the customs of the Sioux nation. These manners and customs were explained to me as follows. "You must," said Spotted Tail, "go down to the stream at twilight, sit on the bank, and wait for my niece to come down and fetch water. You will find other young men waiting for her, and probably 1 or 2 of them will jump up and throw their blankets over her head and talk to her. You must watch, and when you see the first sent away by her, and the second, and perhaps also the third, you will try your luck. I am inclined to think you will succeed where others have failed. When you have thrown your blanket well over her head and popped your own beneath it, you can tell her all, and I will answer for it. She will listen. You can tell her you love her, that you admire her, and that if she will marry you, you will give her every comfort and necessary. In fact, tell her all the nonsense young men tell girls when they want to marry. You will go down to the stream, go through the same performance, repeat the same words every evening for 10 evenings. At the end of that time, you will return to me and report the result. Go now, my son. I do not wish to speak to you on the subject until then, so be good enough not to refer to it again." "Our wishes shall be carried out," I replied, "and I will return to you a victor or not at all." "Well said, my son. May good luck attend you," said the chief, as I left him and started off at once on my first experiences in lovemaking. First, I went to my teepee and, selecting one of my largest and best blankets, threw it over my head and wandered. Chapter 6. Breaking our camp in the spring of the following year, we moved east and traveled down the Republican River about 200 miles to fight the Pawnees. They were on the headwater of the Little Blue River. Reaching a part of the country through which we knew our enemies must pass, we pitched our camp and remained there 3 months, watching for them. Buffaloes were plentiful in our vicinity, and for 60 miles east of the point where we established ourselves. We knew exactly where the Pawnees would go for their summer hunt. They would require white skins, such as buckskin, antelope, and elk, and buffalo cow skins for the purpose of making teepees and moccasins. In the summer, the Indians, as a rule, do not trouble to secure buffalo robes. The fur on the skin of the animal is then very short and does not become long and woolly until about the 2nd week in October. All skins taken after the latter date and until the 1st of May the ensuing year are religiously set aside as robes. On the 1st of May, the teepee or moccasin season commences. It will be seen that good robes can only be obtained during about 6 months in the year. In August, the animals traveled north or northwest. We knew this, and also that the Pawnees would follow them as soon as they began to migrate. We discussed the exact locality of the enemy, and secreted ourselves so as to give us a great advantage over him when he came tripping merrily into our ambuscade. We had scouts continually watching his movements and trying to find out his strength. 3 or 4 of the smartest and bravest of the Sioux would hide themselves close to the Pawnee camp during the daytime. At night they would crawl into it and count the number of the teepees. In this way they calculated the number of warriors, reckoning that there would be 5 to each teepee. I have always been able to tell the number of Indians in a camp by this means. About the 5th of August, the enemy made a move and approached within 5 miles of where we lay in a thick grove of cottonwood timber. Our scouts came running in and reported he was close at hand and that he had encamped for the night. A hurried consultation was held, and it was resolved that, instead of waiting for him to fall into our trap, it would be better sport for the young men to attack him where he lay. Consequently, at 12 o'clock at night, I, in company with all our warriors, except a few old men who were left to guard the camp, sneaked as close up to the Pawnees as we could, and then waited for daybreak. As the first streaks of early dawn shot across the horizon, the enemy's women got up and turned the horses loose to graze. This was just what we were waiting for. A few of us made a dash for the herd. Our main body lay concealed in a ravine close by, and it was arranged that the horses should be driven into the ravine for the purpose of drawing the Pawnees thither. Everything happened as we had anticipated. I was one of the horse-stealing party and helped to drive off the herd. We chiked them into the ravine and cleaned through it like a streak of lightning. Directly the Pawnees saw what was up, and so few of us engaged in the daring robbery. They yelled with rage and came tearing after us right into the trap. After driving the herd into a place of safety, I returned to see how the fun was going on, when I discovered that my Sioux had killed 125 men, women, and children as they fled in all directions. It was an abominable slaughter, but I personally could have done nothing to prevent it. The only reflection was that if the boot had been on the other foot, we should have met the same fate. This was the first hard fighting I had witnessed between Indians, and it impressed me considerably. Chapter 7. Speaking the Sioux language fluently by this time, I was of considerable assistance to the members of my tribe in trading with any whites we now and then came across. As a rule, it was very exceptional for us to meet any of these roving traders. They had too much respect for their scalps to penetrate into the remote regions where we were. In journeying to and fro, we used to meet one old fellow, a Canadian Frenchman, pretty well known on the plains, and barter with him some of our buffalo robes for old flint muskets, lead, powder, beads, blankets, knives, anything handy he might have. I was still living with Two Buck Elk, and the more I was with him, the more he seemed to like me. He was a man about 40 years old, very brave, and very fond of whiskey. It was not often we could get hold of any of this, and when we did, it was the most horrible compound imaginable. Firewater was a mild term for it. It was made out of grain of any kind, and so strong it would take the skin off one's throat in swallowing, whether mixed with water or not. I have seen an Indian take a big drink of it, and in less than 10 minutes lie down and die. The old Canadian Frenchman was never known to have more than a gallon of the spirit along with him. He would bury the rest in a place that he himself only knew, and when he had bartered off his portable supply, go and dig up another gallon. This was a pretty cute move on his part, for it was not worth the Indian's while to kill him for loot, as it would only have been killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. I think some of Two Buck Elk's love for me arose from the way in which I got the whiskey out of this old trader. As I was a white man, he would let me have it rather than the Indians, and many is the time I have secured it for my friend over the heads of Indians, who offered even better bribes than I. Somehow the old chap imagined that by my influence with the tribe I could guarantee his safety, and I encouraged him mum the belief in order to obtain his pernicious poison. At the same time, I verily believed that I did him many a service with the tribe, for I always spoke up for him, and pointed out that if any harm happened to him, we should be in a pretty fix for anything we wanted. Also, that no other white man would be likely to follow in his footsteps if he were killed. It was upon one occasion, after I had secured a gallon of this whiskey for Two Buck Elk, that in a moment of generosity, and in return for the service I had rendered him, he asked me if I would not like to marry one of his nieces, and suggested the eldest, one named Zint-Kala-Wee-Ah. I said I should be very pleased to do so, but pointed out that I had no horses. I only had 2 left when I returned from that hunting expedition, and found Wombelly Zizi gone, and one of these I had given away when I divorced her. He said, "Never mind that. We will make it up for you." The following morning I found 10 ponies tethered outside the teepee. I went through the same formality as before and started my wooing down by the stream, but on this occasion no time was lost, and in 2 days I was fixed in a teepee of my own, with Zint-Kala-Wee-Ah, my blushing bride. She was a fine, tall girl of pleasing appearance, rather thick-set, but thin compared with my former woman, and 15 years of age. As she was the eldest daughter of her teepee, in accordance with Indian custom, I had the right of exercising a claim upon all her 3 sisters, none of whom could be mated without my consent. I thought it would simplify matters at once by claiming the whole outfit, which I accordingly did, as a compliment to the family. I got along with Zint-Kala-Wee-Ah all right, and about a month after my marriage with her, took her next sister into my wigwam. I found having a couple of wives very pleasant, and after 3 months had elapsed, increased my responsibilities by taking in the 3rd. The 4th was hardly big enough to be bothered with at present, so I left her to grow a few years older. I was now quite a respectable member of the community, and could hold my own in point of importance with any of the chiefs of the tribe, both in the turnout of my establishment and the orderly way in which it was conducted. My 3 women, being sisters, knew each other's little ways and peculiarities. The harmony existing amongst them was delightful. Altogether they presented an example which might with advantage have been copied throughout the tribe. We wandered about from one place to another, replenishing our stores when necessary, until finally the tribe worked round to Cottonwood Springs, the place where I left the caravan and first joined the Indians. It seemed ages to me since the day I marched into their camp. 5 years had elapsed since then, during which I had wandered far and near for hundreds of miles in a gigantic circle, of which this spot may be said to have been the center. Situated on the Platte River, this was a very convenient and favorite place with both the Ogalallas and Brules. Here they usually met about once a year, and joining forces, went off together to meet other bands of the Sioux or attend the great religious ceremony of the Sun Dance. It is in this district that the Platte River branches into the North and South Plattes, and situated at the base of the angle, formed by these, is Cottonwood Springs. This point in after years became better known as McPherson. It was from here that the California route branched off from the Platte and took a direct course. The tide of emigration to the Pacific had not set in at the time of which I am writing, for it was only in the year 1847 that this country was ceded by Mexico to the United States. A caravan on the plains in these days was a rare sight. Those that did come out were only traders of the Hudson Bay or the American fur companies. It was, therefore, a matter of considerable surprise to me when one morning our scouts brought in the information that a large train of whites were moving along the bank of the river towards us. During the afternoon they arrived and encamped within half a mile of where we were. A long time had now elapsed since I had seen or spoken to any of my fellow countrymen fresh from civilization, and accordingly I thought it would be a good opportunity to polish up my mother tongue before I forgot it, as well as to learn a little. Chapter 8. The Mormon caravan consisted of 20 wagons drawn by mules. Some of the teams for the heavier wagons were 6 in number, and those for the lighter ones 4. We had plenty of ammunition and guns, a brass cannon, agricultural implements, a smith's forge, iron for making sawmills, hawsers with pulleys for crossing streams, whilst the commissariat was well provided. The first thing that struck me was the sermons Brigham delivered directly we corralled at night. He would declaim for an hour, and we had to sit around and listen. Sometimes he would be followed by others, and the ranting would be kept up for 2 or even 3 hours. I never paid much attention to what they said. It was all about the Lord, with whom they seemed to be on intimate terms of acquaintanceship. I felt at once that I was not good enough, and never should be, to belong to their denomination. So I used to squat down and smoke and build castles in the air, whilst their services were going on. These always wound up with lots of quaint hymns, which, as a rule, awoke me from my reverie. This life became very monotonous after a time, and when no one was looking, the old Mexican, who turned out to be a very decent chap, and I would crawl under the wheels of a wagon and have a game at euchre. After service was over, Brigham and the rest of them would laugh and chaff in a jolly convivial way that made me take quite a fancy to them. Many a time have I skinned Brigham out at euchre, and many a time he has turned the tables, but as a rule he was very hard to beat at that game. The followers generally seemed to me an ignorant lot of people drawn from the lowest classes. The religious mania had a decidedly strong grip upon them, and I believe if these lengthy services had not been held every day somebody would have been killed. They would have thought as little about murdering me as they would one another. By the time we arrived at Fort Laramie, I had become quite accustomed to my new life. There I met some Indians I knew. I stayed with them 2 days, whilst the tires of some of the wagons were being repaired. Brigham Young came to me and asked me to go on with them. He said that both he and Rockwell were thoroughly satisfied with me, and they felt they would never arrive at their destination unless I remained with them and took them across the desert. I said I had no objection, and the existing agreement was continued. There was an old Frenchman at the fort with a half-breed daughter. To her Brigham took a great fancy, and he tried hard to get her to join the party. But Le Père would not consent. Curiously enough, it was here I saw for the first time the father of my present wife, Old Smoke, then chief of the Sioux Nation. I little thought that his daughter would one day be my woman. After the repairs were fixed up, we started off again. But before this, I sent a message to Spotted Tail, telling him not to be uneasy about me, that I was all right, was going on with the whites as far as the Black Hills, and would return as soon as I was able. At Laramie, we picked up about a dozen people whom the Mormons had managed to inveigle into joining their community. They had a good, hard try to get me into the fold, and held out as an inducement the bait of half a dozen wives. I said that was good enough for me, but I would reserve my decision until later on, especially as I had matters concerning their welfare and safety on my mind that were more important for the moment. So they agreed not to pursue the subject further and left me unmolested for quite a considerable time. Our route was now across the North Platte, leading straight for the Rocky Mountains. Here, for 150 to 200 miles on the plains, we saw hundreds of thousands of buffalo. Of these, we killed as many as we required for food, carrying along with us a lot of the meat, which we dried in the sun. In this part of the country, as we went onwards, we came upon several streams and rivers. These streams mostly came from the mountains, were as cold as ice, and ran as swiftly as a cataract. The riverbeds, moreover, were full of large boulders, and on all sides were precipices. Crossing these streams, too deep to ford, was always a matter of much danger. The way we set about surmounting the difficulty was as follows. We felled a large pine tree and started a good man's sawmill. That is, with a whipsaw divided the timber into lengths and stood it on end to dry. This, in that climate, it does very readily. With these we constructed a flatboat capable of carrying 2 or 3 tons. The way we got this across the stream was by stretching a large rope across, fixing it to a tree on either side, and then fastening a rope to each end of the boat, with a guiding rope fixed to a beam in the boat. By this means we towed the craft backwards and forwards with ease. In crossing very wide rivers, where it was impossible to get a rope across, we constructed a large raft, and starting from some convenient spot, drifted across as well as we could, with the assistance of long sleepers or oars cut from young pine trees. Sometimes it took us quite a fortnight to get across a river, a method of traveling somewhat different from the present. When we arrived at the Green River, the largest we had as yet met with, we built a house and established a ferry boat. In view of those who were to come after us, we left here 5 men, with instructions to charge $10 for every wagon they brought across. This ferry afterwards proved a very considerable source of revenue to the Mormons as a way of transport, not only for their own people, but for emigrants bound for California. We pushed on to Bear River and across to a district of alkali beds. Here we had the misfortune to lose several head of cattle through the herders allowing them to drink of the poisonous water. Traversing this inhospitable waste without delay, we again struck the verdant pasturage of the plains and made our way through the hilly country into the valley beyond. In the far distance, the inaccessible and snow-clad peaks of the Rocky Mountains glistened with all the hues of the rainbow. The trials and troubles of pioneers opening up a new country seem never to have been appreciated at their full value. Crossing the Chapter 9. A curious circumstance that only came to my knowledge 40 years after this parting was communicated to me by Mr. Arthur Rowbottom. After I had left my Mormon companions, they came 10 miles on the plains across the large body of their people whom they were bound to the States to fetch out. This party consisted of 666 wagons and over 2,000 men, women, and children. It appears that they were too eager to await the return of the pioneers, and worked themselves up into such a pitch of excitement about the Promised Land that they blindly followed the footsteps of Brigham, not knowing whither they would lead or what would happen. The rejoicings were great at the meeting, and a grand dance and orgies took place, which were kept up all night. Even after all these years, I feel mad to think I was only about 20 miles distant when all this occurred, and did not participate in the revels. I am sure the Canadians and myself would have enjoyed it, and we might have been of some assistance in scaring off a band of Ute Indians who got in amongst the stock whilst the orgies were in full swing and cut loose 95 horses. These Utes were followed 200 miles into the Black Hills before they were made to relinquish their prey. In about 3 weeks, we arrived upon our trapping grounds and set to work after otter as well as beaver. We were very successful in our catches, but the pleasure of the sport, such as it was completely marred by the fact of our having perpetually to be on the lookout for hostile Indians generally, and particularly Utes, who seem to have appropriated this part of the country as their own. We had several skirmishes with these latter, who, in addition to worrying us in other respects, were always trying to steal our horses. In all our little misunderstandings, we managed to come off best, inasmuch as we were armed with rifles, whilst the Indians only had bows and arrows. I killed and scalped my first Ute in one of these scrimmages. I had frequently grassed Indians before, but my fancy had never taken the form of scalp lifting. These Canadians, however, made a practice of it, and their twitting me with being a woman rather got my dander up. I resolved, therefore, that the first Ute I shot I would treat in the orthodox manner. I am not particularly squeamish, but I must confess it was with no feelings of pleasure that I set about the task. The result was as may be expected. I made a fearful mess of my initial subject. The great knack is to get the scalp lock away from the skull, and this is only to be done artistically by making a deep incision with a sharp knife round the base of the lock, twisting the latter round the wrist, then giving it a strong, sharp jerk, when it comes away readily enough. The incision must be made right down to the skull, or it is no use. Cutting through the skin of the head is like cutting through the toughest leather. After my companions had considerately shown me how to perform the feat, I found I could do it with the utmost facility. I had seen the Sioux lift scalps over and over again, but I had never had the curiosity to watch them sufficiently closely to acquire the artistic touch necessary for the purpose. The way the Indians grow the hair and plait it from the center of the head from a circular parting tends to the removal of their adornment with far greater ease than they themselves experience in taking the hair of a white man. The Indian grows his hair for the express purpose of forming a scalp lock. We on the prairies grow ours long because, as a rule, there is nothing to cut it with. I used to sit and listen at nights to the stories of my companions about their fights with Indians. I thought I knew something about it, but my experiences up to then seemed child's play to what they had gone through, if all they said was true. I have since then had no reason to question their veracity. We moved about from place to place along the river, always working up the stream, until at length we reached a well-timbered district with thick brush all along the river's bank and extending some distance from the bank. At this point we could command a good stretch of water, and seeing several weeks' work before us, we built a snug little shanty and made ourselves as comfortable as circumstances would permit. One night we were seated round our fire, talking and smoking, when suddenly we heard the brush crack close to us. One of our party, a one-eyed man, jumped up, clutched his rifle, and walked outside. It was pitch dark, no moon, and not a star to be seen. Within a few seconds of his leaving the place, the report of his rifle was heard, followed by a movement in the brush. Then all was still. Returning to us, he said, "Pards, I have shot one of the biggest grizzlies that ever made tracks this side of the Snowy Range, right between the eyes." We laughed at him and said he couldn't have hit a teepee at 10 yards range a night like that, although we gave him credit for having scared away the animal, whatever it was, which had paid us a visit. We went out at daybreak the following morning to look at our traps and bring in the captured otter. I was in advance of the party and walked a few. Chapter 10. In the spring we encamped on the Republican River, about 60 miles south of what afterwards became Fort Kearny. There was capital sport there, as the district was full of game of every description. Our tribe had 65 lodges, each containing 7 Indians. 2 buck elk was in command, and Black Crow second chief. I was looked upon as a sort of counselor or friend of both, to advise and assist them in their dealings with the whites. About this time, 1849, the route to California was well opened up, and in addition to frequent caravans passing through, mails were running every month over the route across which I had recently piloted Brigham Young. These mail coaches were drawn by 6 mule teams and accompanied by an outrider. The journey pretty risky one, and very few undertook it. We heard of these mails and their occasional running from the caravans which we frequently came across. I noticed that the more caravans we met, the more demoralized my tribe of Brules became. Whiskey grew to be a commodity they would sell their souls for. The more the settlers came out, the more they seemed to bring with them. Scenes of drunkenness became frequent in our once happy home, and I saw that the time was not far distant when I should have to make tracks and either join some more sober band whose country did not lie on the route of temptation, or make a strike out on my own account in some direction I had not then settled upon. My woman, Konghesapawi'a, and I had got along pretty well up to this point, barring her periodical violent outbreaks of temper. She was a bit frightened of me, however, and although she made a terrible fuss, I don't think she would have proceeded to extremes for fear of getting the worst of it. In other respects, she was a good woman and attended to me better than any of her predecessors had. Things, however, came to a crisis in rather an unexpected manner with her. A brother of 2 buck elk, an uncle of hers, not in our camp, died, and news of his death was brought to us. Of course, there was a terrible hullabaloo amongst the family, and Konghesapawi'a showed her grief as much as any of them. I got a bit tired of this after a couple of nights and went out into the prairie where I could be at peace and away from the infernal howling and moaning. I had a good night's rest and came into camp on the following morning feeling quite fresh and ready to bear up against any amount of woe. When I got to my teepee, I saw a crowd around it and found Konghesapawi'a's grief had taken an acute turn. She was giving away everything I possessed. My horses had all gone, my clothes, beaver traps, saddle and bridle, powder horn, and even my gun. I could not stand the latter going, and seeing it in an old woman's hand, I grabbed at and secured it. Even the teepee had been given to some brute who ought to have known better than accept it. I could do nothing. The custom of the Indians is to give things away when they have a mourning fit on, and for what my woman did, I was responsible. Apart from this, there was no way of getting the things back after they had once been given. I went into the teepee, sat down, and looked at my woman. If I hadn't felt so mad with her, I should have laughed outright. I never saw such an object as she looked. With a butcher's knife she had hacked all her hair off except a rough-looking fringe which hung in irregular lengths over her face. Her frock she had cut away up to the top of her thighs, and bound the remnant round her waist with buffalo thongs. And the sleeves she had cut off at the shoulders, displaying her bare arms. I thought, well, you're a pretty-looking object to be any respectable man's woman. Still, I said nothing, but merely looked on. Her next performance was to cut gashes in her legs. These started at the top of the thigh and followed one after the other down to the ankle. This she did down each leg, and as some of them were half an inch deep, the blood poured pretty freely from them. Then she did the same to each arm, and finally she started out of the teepee and marched round the camp, a distance of 3 miles, howling, and followed by a parcel of elderly women whom she had picked up en route, also howling. I said to myself, "Ta, ta, Konghesapawi'a, never again for this child. You were no great beauty before, but I'm darned if you ever sleep with me again with those fillets on your legs and arms." So I picked up my gun, went out of my now desolate teepee, and sat down on a hill about a quarter of a mile from camp. I had been there about an hour musing when a little daughter of 2 buck elk came up to me and said her father wanted to see me in his tent. I accompanied the child back to camp, lifted the flap, and entered the chief's tent. "Be seated, brother," said he, after which he lighted his pipe and I lit mine. "Brother," said he, "you seem to be looking downhearted. Cheer up, the sun will shine by and by. There are times when we all feel unhappy, but the Great Spirit above sees us and will take care of us. He feeds the birds and the animals on the prairie, and he will look out for you." I thought to myself, yes, but if I wait for the Great Spirit to give me horses and something to eat, I shall have to wait a long time. Still, I said nothing, and he continued, "Your woman has given away all your horses and everything, but never mind, you will have more. I give you my dun-colored buffalo horse out of the herd. Go and take him and ride him, and if you want any more, take them out of my herd. Take any you like, but the children's horses." I thanked him and said the one he had given me would be enough for the present. Then I went on. "I am going to Laramie. First, because my heart is sad, and the change will do me good. Second, because I am desirous of seeing the Wajaja band of Sioux, whom I have not met for some long time, and amongst whom I have many friends." He said, "All right, brother, go, but come back soon. I shall miss you." The fact was, I had made up my mind to get clear of the Brules for the reasons already stated, and the act of my woman gave me a good opportunity. I put on a face of woe as long as a fiddle, and the next morning flung my rifle over my shoulder, and getting on 2 buck elks, dun-colored buffalo hunter, rode solemnly out of camp. It was 65 miles to the Platte River, and I made my way straight to it, arriving by sundown. There, much to my delight, I found a party of emigrants encamped, numbering 45 wagons. They didn't much like the look of me when I rode into their camp. I had an old buckskin coat and leggings on, and was altogether one of the wildest objects imaginable. They took me for a cutthroat or horse thief, anything their fancy chose. A white man alive out that distance on the prairie was sufficient to create alarm on the minds of any peaceful body of emigrants. I sat on my horse in their midst for quite a while before any of them asked me to get down. Then one old fellow said to me, "Won't you get down and have a rest?" I said, "I don't mind. I have ridden a long distance today and feel a bit tired." We got talking, and he told me the party came from Missouri. Chapter 11. Arrived at Laramie, I bade adieu to my emigrant friends. They, after a few days' rest, resumed their journey to the far west. At the fort I met a party of Canadians who had been trading up the Missouri River. They had come down to the American Fur Company's depot, just established here. Their object was to sell skins and purchase goods for barter with the Indians up in North Dakota. The 2 chief men of the party were Valandry and Joe Jewett. With them I engaged at a salary of $75 a month to act as interpreter. This just suited me, for the Indians they proposed trading with were the Wajaja band of the Sioux, whom I wanted to meet. Our outfit consisted of from 25 to 30 head of ponies. Upon them our stores were packed. There were no wagons in those days for expeditions of this description. Each man had to look after so many of the ponies, and was responsible for them and the packages they carried. We set out from the fort in October, and soon arrived at the North Platte River, when our troubles began. The North Platte is the worst river to cross in America. At this point it is quicksand, dangerous to man and beast. A horse, walking along the solid sand in a moment, would sink down up to his belly, and if he was not at once got out, would in a few minutes be sucked under. I have seen many horses and their riders disappear in this way without being able to help. My usual plan was to throw a lariat over the rider and pull him out of his saddle, and save him first. Then, if the horse had not sunk too deeply, we repeated the operation on it. Many is the life I have saved this way, and upon more than one occasion I have been rescued myself. An Indian pony knows the dangers of quicksands and instinctively avoids them, but an American horse will flounder on. Once I saw a company of soldiers go into one of these sands, and those who got out saw their companions and their horses disappear one by one before their eyes. We selected a spot where the river was a little over a mile wide. There we built a raft, and packing our goods upon this, drove the ponies into the water and swam them across. It took us a day to make the passage, and we arrived on the opposite side, without accident to man or beast. I recollect that the water upon this occasion was very cold, and the quantity of tarantula juice we had to drink to keep our circulation going was surprising. Tarantula juice is 2 quarts of alcohol, a few burnt peaches, a plug of black tobacco, put in a keg, and filled up to 5 gallons of water. This concoction was a great favorite with both trappers and Indians. It is the most intoxicating compound drinkable. Its effects last, and a man once drunk on it remains drunk for a week. We continued our journey north to the foot of the Black Hills, to the Rawhide Buttes. This name is derived from the fact that one of a party of emigrants who had sworn to kill the first Indian he met here came across a woman and her child. He made his words good by dispatching them both, but atoned for his deed in an unexpected manner. The main body of Indians, discovering the murder, followed the caravan and insisted. Chapter 12. We have now arrived at the year 1853. In the fall of that year, government established Fort Kearny, about 300 miles east of Fort Laramie. About this time, a party of Mormons were passing through to Salt Lake City. Some 30 miles below Laramie, they left one of their cows, which had become footsore, on the banks of the Platte River. Leaving the cow there for a day's rest, a party returned on the following day to drive it on into camp. In the meantime, a band of Indians had come along. As they were in want of meat, they killed and ate the cow. The Mormons, upon arriving, found nothing but the skeleton left. At this they were naturally very irate, whilst the Indians were proportionately penitent, offering to pay for the damage they had done. The Mormons, however, would listen to no explanations or apologies. They started off to the fort in a state of high dudgeon and reported the circumstance to the commanding officer with many embellishments and untruthful details, magnifying the incident into a brutal attack by the Indians upon a quiet and peaceable party of emigrants. The result was that a lieutenant and 28 men and an interpreter were sent down to the Indian encampment, about 12 miles on the south side of the North Platte River. This village consisted of some 2,000 Indians, none of whom had been implicated in the cow incident and consequently knew nothing about it. The name of the officer was Lieutenant Grattan, that of the interpreter a half-breed, Wayuse. The party was armed with 2 pieces of artillery, a 10-pound and a 6-pound brass gun, and officer, interpreter, and men were all drunk when they arrived on the scene of operations. Taking up a position on a hill overlooking the village, the interpreter was sent in with a message ordering the chief to come up immediately. No attention was paid to this command, the Indians not understanding what it meant, or for what the soldiers had come. In a short time the interpreter again returned to say that if the chief did not put in an appearance within 5 minutes, the village would be fired upon. This riled them, and the chief sent a message to the effect that they must all be drunk, and had better go back to the fort. If the white chief there wished to talk to him, he had better send sober men whom he could understand. The result of this was that firing instantly commenced from the artillery. The shots were directed through the teepee poles. The first cut down several, and the second passed through the chief's lodge, killing an old bedridden chief and wounding several of the women. These 2 shots were all they fired. The blood of the Sioux was up. They made one charge upon the party and killed every one of them. The interpreter started off on his horse towards the fort, but was overtaken by one of the Indians, his own brother-in-law. Wayuse threw up his hands, but the Indian said, "Brother-in-law, you have made my heart sad. You have come down here with these drunken soldiers and attacked us while we were at peace. We have killed all of them. Now I am going to kill you with one of your own shots." So, with the revolver which he had taken from the lieutenant, he took his own life. The Indians broke up the gun carriages and tried to make holes in the guns by firing bullets at them. I saw these guns with the shot marks on them when they were ultimately recaptured. When this incident occurred, I was with 2 buck elk on the Republican River, about 100 miles southeast of Cottonwood Springs. News was brought down to us of the massacre of the troops and instructions from Spotted Tail to go on the warpath at once, that soldiers were coming down to fight us, and that all bands were to concentrate in his part of the country without delay. Mautuawayu, or the Bear that lay amongst the rocks, was then chief of the Sioux Nation, and Little Thunder and Spotted Tail were the two chiefs in command of all the Indians in the neighborhood. I had a consultation with 2 buck elk as to what was to be done. He said he did not want to fight the whites, and was quite content to remain where he was, hunting and trading in peace. Ultimately, it was decided that I should go to Fort Kearny and ascertain if the reports we had heard were true. If they were, I was to remain there, as I could not fight against the soldiers. If they were untrue, I was to return as speedily as possible. 2 buck elk's last words to me were, "Remember, brother, I don't want to fight, and I wish you to tell the soldiers that." When I arrived at Kearny, I heard the whole story, and that the soldiers were on the point of marching to the relief of Fort Laramie, which it was feared would be attacked and taken by the Indians. After the massacre, Spotted Tail and 6 of his chiefs had waylaid the mail, robbed it, scattered the letters all over the prairie, shot the driver and the passengers, and stolen the mules. This brought General Harney out with reinforcements, and he marched right on to Laramie in search of the Indians. On his way thither, he came across Spotted Tail at a place called Ash Hollow, midway between the forts. Following him by a forced march, Harney made him fight before he could amalgamate with another band. The result was that nearly the whole of the Indians were killed, and 2 of Spotted Tail's women and 3 of his children were captured. If the Indians at this time, instead of being scattered all over the country, had only concentrated their forces, they would have killed every white man in the country, soldiers and all, for they numbered over 20 to 1. This battle put an end to the outbreak for the time being, but it was only the foreshadower of subsequent events, such as have had, perhaps, no equal in the world's history. The captured women, children, and other prisoners were sent down to Fort Kearny and brought in a few days after my arrival. I recognized them at once, and going up to the women, said I was sorry to see them there. As I was the only white man in the fort who could speak the Sioux language, I was appointed interpreter. There were about 25 prisoners in all, and many of them were badly wounded. Spotted Tail's women asked me to write to him and say where they were. This I did by sending a letter to Fort Laramie, where it was translated to some of the Sioux and the message sent to him somehow. General Harney was still at Laramie. Much to his surprise, some 10 days after Spotted Tail had received my message, he turned up at the fort and, with 2 of his chiefs, gave himself up as a prisoner. Spotted Tail immediately asked for the general, and walking up to him, held out his hand, saying, "Brave man with the 3 stars, you have captured my wives and children. I want to die with them. I fought you, and I fought you hard, but against odds. I surrender to you, not because I am whipped, but because you have captured my wives and children. Do as you like to me. Hang or shoot me if you will, but let me see them first." The general replied, "Spotted Tail, I like you because you are a brave man, and I will see that you are treated as a brave should be. I will send you to where your wives and children are." So he was sent to Fort Kearny, where I received him. He cried like a child when he saw one of his little children shot through the leg. After the meeting with his wives, I had a long talk with him. He wanted to know where he was to be sent. I told him to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, there to be kept a prisoner. He was put in a 6-mule wagon with his women and sent off. I wished him goodbye and told him to cheer up and that we should meet again. As a matter of fact, he was kept a prisoner for 2 years. It was the first time I had seen him since the memorable day when I left him to guide the Mormons to Salt Lake. I told him he made a great mistake in fighting the soldiers. He said he had no idea there were so many as he found out. He thought that those who had met and beaten him were all the whites in the world. I was offered a billet by the government agent to help in the construction of a larger and stronger fort at Kearny, and was engaged to drive a team to haul in the wood for that purpose and also for the winter's supply of fuel. The soldiers had to cut down the trees, load the wagons, and unload them at the fort. All I had to do was to deliver my loads safely. The place we were working at was only 3 miles from the fort, but it was pretty dangerous work as we were frequently attacked by Indians. One day they jumped us and sent us flying in all directions. It was a case of everyone for himself. I never saw soldiers run so fast. I hadn't a chance to get away, so I crawled in amongst a heap of loose logs that I was loading up with. The Indians cut my team away from the wagon and went off with them. When they had gone, I crawled out, swam the Platte River, and made tracks to the fort as quickly as I could, where I reported 3 men dead and several wounded. Tarantulas were our most dangerous enemies. Whilst we were wood-cutting, they would get in the bark, and before they could be detected, they would have stung or crawled over some part of the body. Even in crawling over the hand, they leave a red inflammatory streak behind, which subsequently turns black, and the flesh rots off, while mortification and blood poisoning supervene. I remember one day one of the soldiers threw a log over his shoulder and, not noticing one of these reptiles on it, got stung in the neck. He threw the log down at once and, turning to a man standing near, said, "Take this knife quickly and cut a big lump of the flesh out of my neck," he putting his finger on the spot. The man was frightened and refused, whereupon the soldier pointed his revolver and said, "If you don't, I'll shoot you." This quickened the man up a bit, and he took out a thick piece about as big round as a $10 piece. Strange to say, this soldier lived. A tarantula bite is always fatal, whereas a rattlesnake's is not. There is one antidote for a rattlesnake's bite, and I have saved many lives with it. On the prairie grows a sort of creeper with a pod something like a pea, only the seeds are no bigger than mustard seeds. These, pounded up and put into a slit made over the bite, will immediately stop any ill effects. That is, if the remedy is applied soon after the bite has taken place. I stayed working at the fort until it was finished and left there in the fall of 1855, starting out trapping with a man named Hal Gay. Chapter 13. Hal Gay was a smart devil-may-care sort of fellow, and one that I felt I could work with. So we pooled our wealth together and bought spring traps, a teepee, a few head of horses, and started off to try our luck with the beaver. I knew all the streams round about, and the only spots where the animals were to be found. It took us a couple of months to get to the ground. Then we set seriously to work, first going down both the Beaver Rivers, the Short Nose, and Little and Big Solomon. Then we worked north towards the Platte River, and from there to the Republican, down on to the Stinking Water and Red Willow, and so back to Fort Kearny, where we sold our furs for quite a decent sum. A small town named Dogtown had sprung up in our absence, about 3 miles from the fort. It consisted of 2 stores, a few dwelling houses, and 4 whiskey saloons. Hal Gay and I went down there, and putting our capital together, started a whiskey bar. This brought the number up to 5. Our shanty was the best of the lot, and as we were both popular men, it was not long before we were doing the best trade in the place. All the soldiers from the fort used to patronize us, and we hit upon the expedient of starting a private room for the use of the officers with a gambling saloon leading from it. Every one, far and near, came to our place, which we called the Robber's Roost. The opposition shanties melted away one by one, and we had the monopoly of the trade. We were on the direct route to the west, and a provost marshal was sent down from the fort to see that no caravan started out beyond Dogtown unless it mustered over 100 men. This was on account of the Indians, of whom a few wandering bands were always on the lookout to attack any small party. This all just dovetailed in with our ideas, for the provost marshal stood in with us, and would detain the caravans as long as he could in order that we might skin the emigrants out of their money, either by gambling or by drinking. I never had so much cash in my life. It just came pouring in. As business increased, we provided for the demand by establishing Monte, poker, faro, dice, roulette, and every game calculated to take the fancy. In fact, so popular did our place become that we built quite a big gambling saloon, in which many a poor fellow lost not only his money, but his life. The shootings subsequently became so frequent that we had to establish a graveyard at the back of our place, 100 yards or so out on the prairie. There are tricks, they say, in every trade, and ours was no exception to the rule. Our game was to get the migrants in to drink and gamble. Once they were there, we could look after them, but they were a bit shy and wanted coaxing in. This we used to work in the following manner. Hal would disguise himself, rubbing a lot of dirt in his hair, over his face and hands, and putting on some dirty, ragged clothes. Then he went down to the caravan corral, talking to some of the men, and brought them up to the town. He then strolled along to the Robbers' Roost and invited them in to have a drink. Once in, it was not long before he got them into the gambling saloon, where he began to play, and invariably won by an arrangement he had with the banker, who was in our employment. Having won a pile, he stood more drinks, and as a result, some of the strangers soon started in. He left off then, for the banker invariably gave him $1 to go and have a drink, saying his luck was far too good, and if he kept on winning all the money, there would be none left for his pals to take away. I don't say there was any cheating done, but the bank invariably came off the winner. I attended to the bar whilst all this was going on. That was my department, and pretty busy I was too, for the more they gambled, the more drinks I sold. Finally, things became so warm and the shooting so frequent, I had a consultation with my partner and suggested our clearing out before we got into trouble. He was quite of my opinion, and we cast round for a purchaser and, finding one, sold our interest in the concern for $700. This was for the goodwill of the business and stock. The house we only rented. There was an emigrant in the town who had come along with a caravan and had remained behind his party to gamble. He had a house on wheels. It was 22 feet long, and quite a nice-looking little shanty, well painted, and as comfortable a house as one could wish for. He got cleaned out at our place and had nothing but this left. He sold it to us, and we fixed it up as a bar, and started up and down the road between Dogtown and the old California crossing on the Platte River, afterwards better known as Julesburg. This was about 160 miles farther west. We would attach ourselves to any caravan going along, the larger the better, and afterwards return with any party coming back. Finally, we became so brave that we used to start out alone and wait for the caravans on the road. One day, as we were jogging along merrily on our homeward trip for a fresh supply of whiskey, a party of Indians swooped down on us. We saw them coming and didn't wait to see who they were. A glance was sufficient to tell us they were on no peaceable mission. Chapter 14. On June 14, 1857, the order was given for those who were to form part of the expedition to clear out of Leavenworth and go under canvas at Salt Creek. This was a general camping ground for emigrants bound west, about 6 miles due west from the fort. Abundance of grass, wood, and water was to be found here, and no more favorable spot could have been chosen for the purpose. We found thousands of Mexicans on the ground, freighting to Mexico, and other points on that route, and altogether the scene was the most lively I had ever witnessed. Our expedition consisted of some 2,000 soldiers and over 200 wagons, each wagon drawn by 6 mules. It took some 2 or 3 weeks to get the teams all loaded and the soldiers ready for the start. This interval was employed by the non-combatants in breaking in the mules, more than one-half of which had never before been in harness. This was done by the wagon masters, each of whom was responsible for 30 teams, taking them on to the prairie, there filling the wagons with sand, starting off for 15 or 20 miles full gallop, pulling up short, forming a corral, getting out their dinner, eating, jumping up, and starting off home again. In this way, the mules, after a few lessons, became quite tractable and gentle. My principal amusement was to go out with these parties and see the fun. I took great delight in tearing over the prairies in this harum-scarum manner, and never saw a team yet that could go too fast for me. At times there was more sport than we wanted, for a whole train of teams would stampede and tear off madly, upsetting and smashing wagons, and killing mules, whilst some of the leaders would break away from the harness and run for miles before they could be recovered. At length everything was in readiness, and we broke camp and started on our long journey. It had been an exceedingly wet season. The prairies were deluged with water, and as the ground was very soft, we made but slow progress. For the first 3 days we only succeeded in getting about half the wagons a distance of 4 miles, the others remaining in camp. By degrees we moved them up through mud and slush knee-deep, and, finally reaching more solid ground, made our weary way through Kansas into Nebraska, crossing en route several streams greatly swollen by the rain. At some of the larger streams we had to give in and sit down and wait until the waters subsided. We went on in this way until we arrived at the South Platte River by the old Californian crossing. Here our real troubles commenced. What with the melted snow from the mountains and the swollen river, it was impossible to get across in the usual way. We waited several days, but instead of receding, the flood rose higher. Our ammunition was packed in zinc wagon boxes made expressly for the purpose, and these were ferried across on rafts. The wagon boxes we caulked to prevent leakage, then propped them up on blocks to keep them from floating off the running gear, put 24 mules to each wagon, and swam them over. In this way, we got over the South Platte River after drowning several mules and 2 men. At Fort Kearny, we passed through Dogtown. The provost had nothing to say this time. The poor old robber's roost had again changed hands and become quite respectable. The gambling saloon had disappeared. The fort had turned its guns on it, with the intimation that if it did not close in a few hours, it and its occupants would be blown into a better land. In its stead, a comfortable hotel had sprung up, and, cruelest of blows to me, had changed its name. 22 miles from the South Platte, we struck the North Platte at Ash Hollow, and had to lower the wagons down the mountainside, which is there nearly perpendicular, for a quarter of a mile. This was more easy than crossing the river. Everything after this went on well, until the whole command received a shock which nearly scared it out of its wits. One of the zinc ammunition boxes, presumably by the jolting, exploded one of the cartridges. The case contained over 1,000, and these went popping off, one after the other, until all were expended. There was some consternation whilst this was going on. The shots were flying out in all directions, amidst yells, shrieks, and execrations. The wagon master had the presence of mind to gallop his team out into the prairie, whilst the entire outfit made for the best cover it could find. The officers tried hard to get someone to go into the wagon and drag out the case, but no one would. The driver, who was wonderfully plucky, kept his team well in hand and never moved, knowing all the time he was sitting on a magazine which might blow him to pieces at any moment. When it was all over, we went out to him, but the strain had been so great on the poor fellow's nerves that he was mad. He was called the Lightning Torpedo Man after that. But although he subsequently recovered, he was always more or less silly. Nothing farther of special interest occurred until we arrived at a long valley, at the extremity of which Ham's Fork is situated. There, to our dismay, we found the Mormons had entrenched themselves on the side of the mountains. Not only had they built breastworks of rock, but in the canyons they had constructed dams in which an immense quantity of water was stored, so that on once lifting the sluice gates, sufficient water would pour down to drown every man of the expedition and wash us clean out of the hills. General Johnson, however, was too wary to run headlong into the trap that had been prepared for him. He ordered the command to effect a flank movement and drove the Mormons over the hills into the city of Salt Lake. On sending out scouting parties, it was discovered that the enemy had fortified every coign of vantage so strongly that it was impossible for us to attempt to get into the valley without reinforcements. We had to settle down, pitch our camp for the winter, and wait until they came out from the States in the following spring. We selected a fertile little valley, well wooded and intersected by a mountain stream, out of the way of danger. Then, pitching our tents, we made ourselves as comfortable as circumstances would permit. The cold weather soon came on apace, and with it the snow, which at first settling on the mountains, rapidly moved down to the valleys and enveloped us. After a while, our supply of provisions began to run low, and an expected train of commissariat wagons was looked for eagerly. These were much overdue, and great anxiety was manifested at their non-appearance. No one thought that any harm could possibly happen to them. There were 90 wagons of provisions expected, each drawn by 6 yoke of oxen. At length one day our scouts returned with the dreadful news that all had been lost. The Mormons had been too clever for us. Crossing the mountains to the southeast of us, they worked round to our rear, and intercepting the convoy on the way, captured and destroyed everything, burning the wagons and stores and driving off the stock. This was a terrible blow. Chapter 15. These were exciting times for many of us. I succeeded in becoming duly installed as a government wagon master, with a large number of the teams under my command. Besides other duties I was called upon to perform, one was to go to the scene of the Mountain Meadow massacre with a party of troops and bury the bodies of the victims. The scene of this butchery was about 80 miles south of Camp Floyd on the Californian route, and the massacre was one of the greatest blots upon the Mormon persuasion. The circumstances were briefly as follows. A party of wealthy emigrants left California for the States and returned with their wives and friends. The caravan was a particularly rich one and carried luxuries and delicacies that only the rich could afford. The Mormons allowed them to proceed through Salt Lake City unmolested, but desirous of possessing themselves of their chattels and also of paying off a score with the emigrants who had scoffed at them whilst in the city. They sent down word to John D. Lee, who was the bishop of the district through which they had to pass, to attack and eliminate the entire caravan and not to spare a single life. This was done by Lee's followers disguising themselves as Indians and attacking the caravan at the spot indicated. There was a small stream here, about 60 yards from the place where the emigrants had corralled at the first signal of alarm. The sham Indians rushed upon them, but were driven off. They, however, took up a position guarding the approach to the stream and cut off all communication with it. In this way, as days went on, and the emigrants became in want of water and went out singly for it, they were shot down by the Mormons. Girls and even children were sent out with pitchers, but they all met the same fate. The Mormons, secreted behind the rocks, shot all who approached. In this way, they killed everyone and eventually became the possessors of the caravan. Our mission was, in addition to burying the bodies, to chastise the Mormons for their cruelty, and the troops required no inducement to do this. They had not forgotten the capture of our provision trains, and many were the deep anathemas hurled at the unrelenting scoundrels as we made for the scene of action. Arrived there, the most horrible spectacle imaginable met our gaze. There were skeletons all over the place, shining in the sun, picked as clean as ivory by the vultures and wolves. Many were lying in the few yards space that separated the ashes of the corral from the watercourse. Beside them were their pails and other articles for carrying water, showing how they had fallen. Here and there, hanging on the sagebrush, were tresses of women's hair, and bones were scattered about wherever the wolves had gnawed them. The soldiers were much overcome at the sight, and many brave men shed tears as they stooped to pick up all that remained of their fellow creatures. Every trace of a human being that we could find we reverently buried, and then retraced our steps homeward, making a slight detour of between 7 and 8 miles to call at a Mormon settlement which we had been told was in the vicinity. There we went to the principal house in the place. The village was deserted by the men, who had all fled, not caring to settle scores with us. Indeed, from the time we left Salt Lake, we had not come across a male Mormon of any description. In the stables of this house we found several fine carriages and horses, quite out of keeping with the surroundings. These at once excited our suspicions. The women that we saw were also dressed in silks and satins, and wearing these garments as ordinary day clothing. The house we ascertained belonged to John D. Lee, the bishop of the district. No one would give any information. The women knew nothing and flatly refused to answer any of our queries. We determined not to be done, and orders were given that every house in the place should be thoroughly searched. Whilst doing this, we found a child in one of them, a pretty fair-haired little thing of about 3 years of age. Her hair hung in ringlets down her back, and she was both bright and intelligent, of a breed not to be expected amongst the class of people who inhabited the place. She was brought to me, and I took her to the officer commanding the expedition. He put her on his knee and began playing with Hen. We thought, as we could get nothing out of the women, we would try the child. After a time she became very talkative, and we romped about with her, crawling over the floor and amusing her to the best of our ability. When her confidence was thoroughly obtained, we led her on with questions, so that when one of the elegantly dressed women was brought in, she pointed at her and said, "That my mamma's frock," pointing to the dress that the woman was then wearing. Then she said, "Naughty Indians come and kill Mama, Papa, and Auntie." This was conclusive proof that we had found the perpetrators of the outrage, and it was as much as the officers could do to prevent the men from lynching every woman in the village. We camped there for the night, hoping to get hold of some of the men, and the following day scoured the country round in search of them, but unsuccessfully. Then we reluctantly resumed our journey, taking some of the women with us and the child. The child was the only one saved out of the 100 or more constituting the caravan. If she is alive now, she will doubtless remember Messiah, should she ever read this book, for she was placed under my charge, and I brought her into Salt Lake City and handed her over to the general. John D. Lee was caught some 5 years later and executed for this and other murders. Returning to Camp Floyd, I resumed my duties as a teamster, until one day a paymaster came out with a lot of specie and gave us all 18 months' arrears of pay. The sensation of having so much money all at once was too much for me, and I suddenly developed a great distaste for my occupation. Just outside the camp there had sprung up a small town called Doby Town, from the dobies or sun-dried bricks of which the houses were built. A young teamster named Louis and myself decided to try our luck there. We sent in our resignations and started, bought a shanty, and opened it as a whiskey saloon. I was always very partial to making as much money as I could with a minimum of labor, and with the experience of the robber's roost fresh in my mind, I knew this was an easy way to set about it. There were plenty of cutthroats, gamblers, and thieves there who supported us, and as the troops also favored us with their patronage, we saw before long that we were in for a very good thing. I believe we should have made a fortune if we had only stayed, but my unlucky star was always in the ascendant, and something invariably happened which snatched the prize from me just as it was within my grasp. This time it occurred very unexpectedly. One night, as I was taking a stroll down the street for a little fresh air, I passed an opposition gambling hell of very bad reputation. I just peeped in through the window to see how they were getting on. There I saw 2 men with their bowie knives drawn, standing over a man who was stretched on the floor. I thought to myself, "Hello, here's a murder. I am better out of this," and I walked away quickly. I was only a few yards past the door when one of the men came running after me and inquired what business I had to look in at his window. I apologized and said I was only looking for a friend. He then called me all the names he could think of and said he would teach me better manners, winding up by making straight at me with his knife and expressing a determination to have my heart's blood. I didn't want any row with him and started off running as fast as I could. He, however, was the quicker of the 2, and finding him gaining on me rapidly, I drew my 6-shooter and called back to him to stop, or I would shoot him. At the same time, I stopped and tried to dodge him. He would not listen and made a dart forward, but I slipped out of his way and fired a shot in the air to let him know that I was capable of defending myself. This seemed to enrage him the more, for he now came at me with his knife like a bull at a gate. I thought, well, you'll soon make mincemeat of me if I don't stop you. So taking aim, I planted him one in the breadbasket, which caused him to pull up very quickly. He threw up his hands and fell backwards with a groan. I told him I was not to blame, that he would have killed me if I had not protected myself, and as I saw some people coming who had heard the shots, I bolted off to my place as quickly as I could. There, I told my partner in a few words what had occurred and cleared out without a moment's delay. In those days, the settlement of these matters was usually decided by the majority. I did not know what friends he had, but a glance told me that the one or two in my place at the time would be no assistance to me. I therefore thought discretion the better part of valor, and the sooner I got, the better. Starting out in the dark, I tramped off and made tracks for Provo City, a Mormon town up the Jordan River, and arrived there in a couple of days, footsore and weary. In a few days I received a message to say that the man was dead and that his demise was not regretted. I was also informed that I was thoroughly exonerated, and a universal desire expressed that I should return. This invitation, however, I declined, on the ground that if I returned, I should probably have to kill some of his friends, who would try to avenge his death, or should get killed myself. The law of 6 shooters was the only one then in existence, and revolvers were called into requisition to settle all matters in dispute. Chapter 16. The government supply trains that had been coming into the country in abundance had for some time past been drawn by cattle, as the supply of mules was exhausted. These cattle were not worth sending back to the States, and were therefore offered for sale in Utah. The spring of 1859 had now set in, and the prospect of fine warm weather opening up made a Californian named Daniel Spencer, whom I got to know in Provo City, hit upon the expedient of purchasing a large number of these beasts for transport to San Francisco as beef. The government preferred to sell them in large batches, and he purchased 3,000. Having done this, his next move was to search round for bullwhackers to drive them over. Besides others, he asked me to join him. I was willing enough to go, but did not feel disposed to leave my young partner Louis in charge of the whiskey store at Dobie. So I wrote to Louis, telling him my intention, asking him to sell the place for the best price he could and to join me as soon as possible. I knew this trip would just fit in with his ideas, for he had an uncle in Frisco whom for some time past he had been very anxious to join. Accordingly, he sold up everything that belonged to us and came over and joined me. I took him to Spencer, who engaged him in the same capacity as myself at a salary of $25 per month, and everything found. 25 men were engaged. All of them had been in the government service as teamsters, and all received the same pay, with the exception of the foreman, a young man, and a perfect gentleman in every respect. I do not know what he got, but my impression always was that he had some interest in the speculation. We started from Provo Canyon, where the cattle were herded, and proceeded comfortably on our journey for some few days. We were 27 all told, and my first impression was that we should have a pleasant time, indeed a sort of picnic, for all the men were good fellows, and I knew many of them. As we got further from Utah, however, and well on the Californian trail, Daniel Spencer began to show himself in his true colors. He was the meanest man I think I ever met. Even the old Frenchman Hal and I had traded for at Laramie was not to be compared with him. We could hardly get sufficient stores served out to us, and we lived almost as badly as during the famine on Ham's Fork. We complained over and over again, but were only met with overbearing observations and abuse. Spencer also developed another unexpected trait, thrashing such of the men as answered him back. The result of this was that some of the outfit left him and returned with parties we met on the road bound from California to Utah. Up to this time he had never said a word to me, for I had not given him cause. Besides, I worked very hard and was a bit of a favorite with the young foreman. Rows were frequent, and the men kept returning, until, by the time we arrived at the gravelly ford of the Humboldt River, there were only 8 whackers left, and they were obliged to work day and night to keep the stock together. We had now covered about 500 miles of our journey, and I was wondering what the next stretch would be like, when, as my luck would have it again, Spencer fell foul of me. I never knew why. I had stood guard 2 nights in succession and worked during the day as well. Coming into camp soon after daylight, hoping to get a little sleep, I met him, and he ordered me to return to the herd until breakfast time. I said I could not, I was tired out, and should be able to do no more work until I had a couple of hours' rest. I could scarcely keep my eyes open. He said if I didn't go he would make me, and came towards me with his whip. I drew my pistol and leveled it at his head. I should have blown his brains out at the first lash. Just then the foreman rushed between us and said, "Mr. Spencer, your conduct towards your men has been disgraceful. This man has done his duty like a man, and now you are endeavoring to impose on him, as you have upon the others. Now I want this stopped. You have only 8 men left, and if you don't mend your ways, you'll die with your boots on, for the men won't stand your abuse any longer." Spencer had also drawn his 6-shooter by this time, and I was watching his every movement, so as to be ready to get in the first shot. The foreman made him put up his pistol, and I turned round and saw Louis with his rifle fully cocked, resting on a wagon wheel. Said he, "Go in, pard, I'm here." Then I went down to the wagon, got out my rifle, returned to Spencer, and told him I wished for a settlement, requesting him to pay me for the time I had worked. He said he would not pay me a cent. "Very well," I replied, "I shall have to pay myself, and I give you notice of my intention. I shall follow you and stampede your stock, and see if I can recover what is due to me in that way." He flew into a violent rage that necessitated the foreman again stepping in between us. The latter said it was only right I should be paid for my services, that I had worked honestly and well, and because we chose to quarrel, that was no reason I should not receive what was my due up to the moment of the disagreement. With a bad grace, Spencer fished out some $30. These I put in my belt, tied my hair bridle round my neck, fixed up my shot pouch, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and prepared to start back. I first went over to the boys, shook hands with them all, and told them I was going back to Salt Lake City. Lewis said he did not want to return to Utah and would submit to anything so long as he could join his uncle in California. "That's all right," I replied. "You go on, my boy. I have no uncle waiting for me, and it matters little where I go as long as I get away from that man." Spencer here came over to the crowd and said to me, "What are you going to do, Nelson? You are surely not fool enough to think of returning alone and on foot?" "Yes, I am," I replied. "But," he continued, "the Paiute Indians are very numerous between here and Salt Lake City, and you have a good 550 miles to cover. It is madness. Besides, we are halfway on our journey. Come, be reasonable. Put down your gun and go back to your work." "Mr. Spencer," I said, "if you have completed your sermon, allow me to have the floor for a moment. I consider you the most unreasonable man I have ever met. You do not know what it is to have good men about you until you lose them. I am going to prove to you that I am one of those good men, and mark my words, you will miss me before I have been gone many hours. It is far better for us to part now. Your temper is a little too hasty for me, and I know what mine is." This I said, cocking my eye down the barrel of my rifle. "Very well," he answered. "I shall have nothing more to say to you beyond this. I shall give you no food to take on your journey." "Oh, that won't hurt me," I said. "What the eye doesn't see, the stomach doesn't miss." "Goodbye, boys," I shouted as I waved my hat and stepped out with a terrible craving for breakfast, which his last words had suddenly awakened. After covering about 5 miles, I could stand it no longer, so I shot a jackrabbit which came skipping across my path. Then I made a fire out of the sagebrush, skinned and roasted him. Refreshed with a drink of water from a stream, I again continued my journey, buoyed up with the reflection that I was at least independent and monarch of all I surveyed. In this way, I traveled for 3 days, living on rabbits, birds, and anything that came within easy range of my gun. My progress had been pretty lively, as I had been making the best time I could by running and walking, or rather sprinting the whole time. Suddenly, as I was urging on my wild career and rounding a huge boulder of rock, I came upon a party of emigrants corralled. They were running in all directions, women and children screaming, dogs barking, some of the men on the top of the wagons, some underneath, and 2 in front of the corral with their rifles cocked and pointed at me. "Good morning, strangers," I said, taking off my hat and making them a polite bow. "You seem in a rather excited state. What's up?" "Just you stop where you are," was the reply, "or we'll blow your blessed brains out." "Thank you," I rejoined. "Your kind offer is quite unnecessary, although I appreciate it all the same. Will you oblige me by telling your captain that a gentleman would like to speak to him?" In a few minutes a good-looking squatter came out with his rifle at the present and made straight up to me. I stood where I was, leaning on my gun, and posing in as artistic a manner as the circumstance of the 2 fellows with their rifles still leveled at me would permit, apart from the fact that those on and below the wagons had now armed themselves and were covering me at all points. "Stranger," I shouted, "I am a friend. Tell your pards to put up their guns. Surely it does not require 50 of you to shoot at one poor devil lost on the prairie." "Who are you, and what do you want?" he inquired. I told him in a few words, and he invited me into the corral. "If you'll give me something to eat," I said, "I shall be eternally grateful to you." "You have come at the wrong time to get any food," they replied, "for we have just been attacked by the Utes and expect them again every moment." "I think you must be mistaken," I said. I know the Indians you mean. We camped here 6 days ago, and they did not interfere with us. What have you been doing to them?" "Nothing," they replied. "Two of our men went down to the stream to get water and had a lot of arrows shot at them." "Oh, that's nothing," I said. "That's only their playfulness. But since you are all a bit scared, I would advise you to get along on your journey as quickly as you can. Anyway, Utes are nasty vermin and very treacherous, and the sooner you put a few miles between yourselves and them, the better it will be for your stock. You are right on their camping ground here, and perhaps they don't like it. They are not likely to follow you. I'll go down and talk to them, and that'll give you an opportunity of getting a good start." They tried hard to dissuade me from my project, and offered to take me through to California free of charge if I would stay with them. I thanked them for their offer, but said I had business in Salt Lake City and must get on there. I was again told I was a fool and would be killed. They gave me a drink of whiskey and a biscuit, and I wished them good day and went on, whilst they whipped up their teams and started off as if the devil himself was after them. I made my way straight down to the stream. When the Indians saw me coming all alone, they came out of the high cane-like rushes, which were very tall there, and stood right in my path. I still went unconcernedly on until I got up to them, when one of them, a tremendously tall fellow, asked me in broken English where I was going, and if I was a Mormon. "Yes, I am a Mormon," I replied, "and I am going home to Salt Lake City." "What ward do you live in?" "Number 15, just below the courthouse." I saw at a glance that he was a white man, although he was painted, and guessed he was one of the fanatical renegade, destroying angels, whose mission was to kill every white man not belonging to the sect, and particularly those who were apostates. He motioned me to follow him, and I followed. He led the way through the thick cane into a clearing where they had cut the cane down and made it into teepees, resembling huge sheaves of corn piled up. On the outside of these, the children had dug holes in the ground. In these holes they were crouched like prairie dogs. We entered one of the teepees and sat down on a bearskin. A woman came in with some boiled venison and cake made out of grasshoppers, a favorite food of the Indians, made by pounding the insects up and mixing with deer fat. The mixture is made into rolls and dried, when it is ready for use. The Ute women, I observed, were very primitive in their costume, wearing nothing but a girdle round the loins, made of the skin of ground moles. These were very pretty in color, some being black, some yellow, and some white. After finishing my repast, I was put through my facings and had to answer innumerable questions, all of which I did apparently to my interlocutor's satisfaction. He did not let out much himself, and I took good care not to let him suppose I could see through him. It was as much as I could do not to laugh at his attempts to keep up the conversation in broken English and by signs. No Indian that I ever saw, be he Pawnee, Cheyenne, Sioux, or Ute, had a mug like he had, and as for his nose, it was raised in Kentucky, or my name is not Nelson. My opinion was that he had been driven out of the Mormon community for some crime, and had found refuge with these Utes, who numbered from 50 to 60 all told. I explained how I had quarreled with the cattle party and was on my way back. He said I had better stay with him until a party came along the other way, as I had a long journey before me, and it was not safe to go alone. I replied that I preferred to get along, and that I was anxious to get back to my wives. It might be months before I could strike a party coming from California, and whilst I was waiting, I was earning no money for the support of those I loved so dearly. In fact, I pitched such a yarn that, desperado as he was, it had a visible effect upon him. Finally, he said that he admired me for my good qualities and would not detain me. So, calling one of his women, he made her pack me up some food to take by the way, and wished me good-bye. I started once more on my journey. I sauntered leisurely along until I was well clear of the canebrake, and then I started off at a run, which I kept up until I had placed a good 20 miles between Mr. White Chief of the Utes and his band of murdering rascals. I was not quite satisfied in my mind whether he might not repent of his leniency and suddenly develop a craving for my gun, pistols, and ammunition. As to his followers, my hair, which was long and wavy, offered an attraction which made all their mouths water whilst I was in the camp. Whether they ever started after me or not, I do not know. I kept on my erratic course for 6 days and nights, and eventually reached a small Mormon settlement of some 10 or 15 houses on the Bear River. I put up at a ranch and stayed there a week, as my legs were so stiff and swollen I could hardly move. In fact, the morning after my arrival, I tried to get up, but could not. I had covered the distance in pretty good time, considering the country I had passed through, and reckoning it over 300 miles, had done on an average about 60 miles a day.